8. Now, there we go. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Heather Bobrowitz, and I am the programming librarian here at South Texas College. And I have the privilege today to introduce to you Marcia Walker McWilliams. She'll be sharing with us a brief history of African American suffragists. Marcia has a PhD in American history with an emphasis on modern American and African American history from the University of Chicago. She's currently the executive director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and the author of Reverend Addie Wyatt, Faith and the Fight for Labor, Gender, and Racial Equality, published in 2016. We also have that book available in our library, so if you want to check it out, go for it. I highly recommend it. She has written and spoke extensively about the history of Black women in various different historical movements, up and to and including current events. In the past, she has curated a year-long exhibit on Reverend Addie Wyatt at the Chicago Public Library and has worked as an archival assistant at the Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection of Afro-American History and Culture. She is taught at Rice University, Prairie View A&M, University of Houston, Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and the University of Chicago. She's won multiple awards, including the Andrew W. Mellon Dissertation Year Fellowship in the Division of Social Sciences. She's also a member of the American Historical Association, the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, the Labor and Working Class History Association, and the National Women's Studies Association. So safe to say, she knows what she's talking about. So we at STC are honored to have her with us today. And with that, I turn it over to you, Marcia.
Thank you so much, Heather. I hope I can live up to that introduction. And thank you to the faculty and to the students who are here today to take part in this presentation. I'm hoping that you will have some questions near the end. So as you have them, definitely drop them in the chat. And I'm going to make sure to leave some time to get to those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that everyone is able to see the presentation. Great. So I want to talk today about a brief history of African American suffragists. So first, let me state this is not going to be a very long and sort of in-depth conversation. Essentially, what I want to do is walk us along a journey of understanding the history of African American women who fought and struggled for the right to vote at different time periods and eras throughout our history, starting with the 18th century and then moving up to the very present with the most recent 2020 election cycle. I really want us to, throughout this presentation, think about the ways in which African-American women sought to first gain the right to vote and then also to protect that right to vote. Those are going to be some consistent themes throughout today's presentation. And the image that I have here on the screen comes from the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was one of the first suffrage clubs started by African-American women in the country. This one in Illinois with a significant base in Chicago. And I'll talk a little bit more about this particular group and their efforts during that point in the presentation. But let's start really with some of the earliest African-American suffragists, what I like to call the first generation. There are two images that you see here. One name you might be more familiar with, which is Sojourner Truth, whose birth name was Isabella Bumphrey. She is pictured there on the left image. And then the right image features Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who you might be less familiar with. And the small text that you see underneath each image is really the citation information. A lot of these images come from the Digital Public Library of America, which has a wonderful digital resource collection on Black women's suffrage. But if we think about this first generation of African-American women suffragists, they had strong ties to the 19th century anti-slavery movement. And really many women who were able to speak in public or to gain more of a public voice did so through the anti-slavery movement. It was really one of the first spaces and places within American history where women were allowed to participate, to be active in this struggle. And so you would see a number of African American women taking part in this particular area. African American women in the anti-slavery movement were active in terms of protesting products that came from slave-produced labor. They were active in protesting some of the atrocities that not only sort of men suffered, but also that Black women suffered during slavery. And so I want to talk a little bit more about Sojourner Truth and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, so you can get a sense of how women from different backgrounds, even though they shared the same racial background, worked within the suffrage movement. So Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in New York in the late 1700s. She's probably most well known for the speech that she gave at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, which many people refer to as the Ain't I a Woman speech, which attested to the fact that Black women under enslavement and even freedom were frequently subject to a lack of protection and rights, that they were not necessarily treated the same ways that white women were. And sort of this sense that, you know, women were supposed to be chaste, women were protected, women were, you know, not allowed to perform certain kinds of labor, women were kept out of things like, you know, politics and these sort of rough and tumble public areas. Sojourner Truth argued that Black women didn't necessarily have those same protections. Part of that having to do with slave labor, but also part of it having to do with ideas that sort of Black women's womanhood was less than and entirely different from that of white women. Truth became very active, especially after she was no longer enslaved, in women's suffrage organizations, arguing that because women had minds and brains and they contributed to society, they should have the right to vote. And many thought that because of her position as someone who was formerly enslaved, white women's suffrage organizations were perhaps more comfortable with her, that they could still see a difference in terms of their social standing and status, and that Truth sort of served as an important vehicle for women's vote. This was somewhat different from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Harper was born into freedom. She came from a family that was fairly, you know, self-sufficient, a family of professionals. And so she grew up being highly educated, right? Having the sense, you know, of literacy, of being able to read and write, having exposure to different professions. And so she very much at the time sort of rivaled a lot of white women who were in the suffrage organizations, in that she was very literate. She often worked and was well known in Black men's leadership circles, but also in white women's suffrage organizations, even though she didn't always agree with their politics. She argued quite effectively for human rights and was very eloquent. She was also known for her poetry and her writing. And she chose to work within white women's suffrage organizations because, quite frankly, Black women's suffrage organizations did not exist at this time. The vast majority of Black women in America during the 18th century were enslaved. And so it was less common to find women like Harper, more common to find women like Truth. And so Harper chose to work within these organizations because really they were one of the primary vehicles in which she could work and speak about, you know, the issues that Black women face and also try to fight for suffrage. One of the things that Harper is well known for is really kind of talking about some of the experiences that she faced. In Black men's leadership organizations, she often had to sort of poke them and say, hey, what about the plight of Black women? And in white women's suffrage organizations, she often had to poke them and say, hey, what about the plight of Black women? So depending on where she was, she had to kind of bear what was called at the time the sort of double cross or dual burden of having both a racialized identity as well as, you know, a gendered identity. Now, you might have heard of the term sort of intersectionality, which comes out of Black feminism in the 1970s, which sort of speaks to this idea of having multiple identities that one has to sort of reconcile and, you know, fight for recognition of. This idea of the double cross or the dual burden is the kind of precedent for that, and one in which Black women frequently spoke about during the 18th as well as the 19th centuries. One crucial point that happens, particularly with Black women suffragists in the 15th Amendment, is this divide that you start to see. So after the Civil War, one of the first sort of amendments that was up for debate was that of giving Black men the right to vote. Immediately, those in the women's suffrage movement had to sort of reconcile their feelings with this. On the one hand, you had white suffragists who sort of believed in universal suffrage, which was that everyone should be able to get the suffrage, including women, versus those who, a smaller part, who sort of advocated or supported what was called Negro suffrage during and after the Civil War. And Negro suffrage essentially meant that Black men would get the right to vote, but that no women would get the right to vote. And there were really two organizations at this time from the suffrage movement: the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA, which was in opposition to the 15th Amendment. This would include women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, probably names that you're more familiar with. These women particularly felt that you should have not necessarily conversations about Black men having the right to vote over white women, that white women should be able to have the right to vote. And in some cases, they would also argue for things such as educated suffrage, which meant only those who were literate would have the right to vote, which essentially would cast out many Black men and women who were still enslaved or who did not have the right to vote. On the other hand, you had the American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA. This would include, folks like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was very much involved with the AWSA, as well as women like Lucy Stone. And they really supported Negro suffrage, or the suffrage for Black men. So this was one of the sort of main differences between these two groups. And there were other differences as well. But what it really showed was that this idea of suffrage and expanding the vote, expanding democracy, and increased rights to citizenship was very much debated throughout this time, sort of during the latter period of the Civil War and immediately after the war as well. The image that you see here is one of Charlotte Forten Grimke, who became one of the most prominent African-American suffragists in the 19th century around the period of the Civil War and after. And she, very much in the vein of Harper and Truth, talked a lot about the necessity for Black women to be able to have the right to vote. They supported Black men having the right to vote, but they also felt like because Black women also faced some of the burdens of enslavement and racial discrimination, they also needed the right to vote or enfranchisement in order to battle against some of these particular issues. The 15th Amendment, officially sort of ratified in 1870, did in fact grant Black men the right to vote. But Black women really sort of seized this in some important ways. They really saw Black men having the right to vote as a sort of sense of Black collectivity, especially across the South, where most African Americans resided. And so Black women would attend state political conventions. Even though they were not allowed to vote, they would attend with Black men. They often would have a vote within their churches, within their own sort of political associations, within their own groups. They would exercise the vote that way, sort of more informally. And then they would also organize political societies like Rising Daughters of Liberty and the United Daughters of Liberty, where they would fundraise for particular candidates, especially Black men who were running for office. And at that time, those who were a part of the Republican Party, which they saw as the party of Lincoln, the party of freedom. So during this period, after the Civil War, most African Americans held allegiance to the Republican Party. And there are also some really interesting pieces of history where you see where, some women attended political meetings in South Carolina and Louisiana in the 1870s. And as the historian Elsa Barkley Brown argues, while the men participated in the meeting, the women guarded the guns, thus serving in part as the protectors of the meeting. African American women in South Carolina and elsewhere understood themselves to have a vital stake in African Americans' men's franchise. The fact that only men had been granted the vote did not mean that only men could exercise the vote. And so there's a couple of interesting points that I want to tease apart here. First is the fact that even though Black men were given the right to vote, that vote was endangered. Groups like the White Leagues, the Red Shirts, the Ku Klux Klan, um, they very much did not support Black men having the right to vote. And so it was very dangerous for men to go to the polls, especially alone. So you would often see African Americans traveling to the polls as families, as communities, as collectives, and often armed in order to protect themselves. And so at some of these political meetings in South Carolina and Louisiana, while the men were going in to cast their vote, Black women would literally be outside watching the guns and manning the guns in case it was necessary to protect that vote that was happening inside. And again, you would also see women sort of making their voice heard and saying, are Black men sort of voting in the best interest of their community, not necessarily themselves? And so there were some interesting ways in which Black women sort of came to bear on the vote, even though they did not have it formally. As with many movements, you will often see generational change. And this is something you can see, even if you're thinking about more recent American history, let's say from the struggles of civil rights activists to the struggles of Black Lives Matter activists today. Each generation kind of comes in with their own thoughts, their own ideas, and different paces at which they want to see change happen. And this certainly happens with the new generation of Black women suffragists that really come of age in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And some of the women that you see, some of the women here on the screen might be more familiar to you than others. So I'll start here with Ida B. Wells Barnett, who some may know as a prominent lynching activist, who ran her own, was a journalist, had her own newspaper in Memphis, and was run out when some of her Black male friends were lynched or murdered. They were accused of raping white women, and Wells sort of took this to task and said this was not the case. It is not right that Black men are being lynched on claims that were not necessarily founded in evidence. And also to the fact that there were large numbers of African American men and women who were being lynched because they had some sort of economic wealth, or they had land, or they had spoken up in defense of Black rights during that time. Wells, in addition to being an anti-lynching activist, was also a voting rights activist, and very much so believed in the right of Black women to vote. Also here is Mary Church Terrell, who was an educator and civil rights activist. She was also a women's rights activist and one of the first Black women to earn a college degree in the United States. And that's a similar vein you're going to see through all of these women, is that many of them, having been born after enslavement or having come of age after enslavement, had access to more opportunities. So on the whole, they're going to be more educated. They're going to be a little bit more like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Also here is Fannie Barrier Williams, who again was an educator, a musician, an artist, and an activist. She was one of the first Black women to serve on the board of a public library, which happened to be the Chicago Public Library. And she also spoke at the 1893 World Columbian Exposition. She was highly involved in what was called the National League of Colored Women at the time, and also very involved in the building and the founding of Provident Hospital, which was one of the first African-American hospitals in the city of Chicago, also famous for having Dr. Daniel Hill Williams in the first open sort of heart surgery. And then also Nannie Helen Burroughs, who you see here as well. Again, an educator and activist and a religious leader who believed that women had greater capacity beyond housework and domestic duties. And so she was very big on women having college education, liberal arts education. And so what you see with this group of women, again, being highly educated and also being very active, even though they came about in sort of the generations after enslavement, what they saw was quite a bit of racial terrorism, domestic terrorism towards African Americans in the form of lynchings, in the form of sort of Jim Crow happening after the sort of moment of radical reconstruction. What they saw was really that, after enslavement, African Americans still had to fight to protect those rights. And so they saw that. At the same time, they saw the need for Black women to be able to have more formal political power and suffrage as a result of this. They also challenged tokenism and racism within white women's suffrage organizations, arguing that because Black women were women as well, they needed to have leadership positions within suffrage organizations, not just to sort of be touted out, at certain rallies or certain public demonstrations, but to actually have their ideas and thoughts resonate with the leadership and the direction of those suffrage organizations. They wanted white women's suffrage organizations to speak out against lynching. They wanted them to speak out against the sexual harassment and assault of Black women. And often it was a challenge because white women's suffrage organizations, by and large, tended to focus on the vote. They tended to focus on the experiences of white women and not necessarily incorporate the experiences of Black women or other women of color. And so what you see in this moment is the formation of different clubs and groups like the National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896, as well as eventually what would come to be some Black suffrage organizations. So in a sense, not really being willing to continue to work within the white women's suffrage organizations that they saw as not meeting their needs. The result was the formation of some of these new groups, many of which spoke directly to the experiences of Black women. And the National Association of Colored Women grew to include more than 50 clubs across the United States and a membership of over 500. And so there were many different clubs sort of within this, as well as other associations that were formed as well. Yet again, now moving into the 20th century, you start to see some changes as well happening with Black women suffragists. Now, during this time period, around sort of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, so from about 1900 to 1920, you start seeing more movement among African Americans. African Americans leaving the South, African Americans leaving rural areas for more urban areas, leaving the South for the Midwest and the North. And so the Great Migration becomes this really important pivotal moment. We often think about that in terms of, getting away from lynching, in terms of moving to the North for economic opportunities, but there's also a political component to the Great Migration. And what you start to see is that with increased numbers of African Americans moving into urban areas in the Midwest, on the East Coast, to a lesser extent to the West Coast at this time, that will increase with the second wave of Great Migration. But really what this starts to do is change some of these urban areas to which African Americans are growing in population, and many urban politicians are seeing them as, potential constituents, that these are people who can help them get the vote. And so the importance there really lies in the fact that the Great Migration becomes a catalyst for seeing more and more states open up women's right to vote at the state and local level. And you had some women who had the right to vote at the state and local level earlier than this moment in the 20th century, but you really do start to see this increase here. So in 1913, the Alpha Suffrage Club, and that was the image on the title slide, was formed in Chicago 1 year after women were granted the right to vote in Illinois. And the image that I have on the left comes from a newspaper article titled The Alpha Suffrage Club. And it's really talking about how they are going to really honor Ida B. Wells Barnett for her efforts at a suffrage parade in Washington. Now, there's a really interesting story here behind this suffrage parade in Washington. This suffrage parade was essentially carried out by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was the mergence of those two groups that formed in the 1860s. And they had a procession in DC, essentially wanting to call national attention to women's right to vote. And the National American Women's Suffrage Association was a predominantly white organization. Ida B. Wells, who had done a lot of work in favor of, women's right to vote, especially Black women being included in that, had also traveled to this demonstration in Washington, D.C. And she's getting in line with, some of her colleagues, and she's told that she has to get to the back of the line. That yes, Black women can be in this parade, but they must be segregated and they must be at the back. So there's this really, interesting tension that happens, and Ida B. Wells is kind of struggling, fighting to get to the front of that, but still being considered a second-class citizen within this fight for women's suffrage. And so again, you would see some of these suffrage clubs formed and really supporting and advocating for the right of Black women to vote. And there's a lot of, kind of controversy that's going to happen as more steam builds up for the 19th Amendment, which in 1920 would grant all women the right to vote. You would even see some of the white suffrage organizations, in order to try to get white men in the South to basically vote for and not be roadblocks to women's suffrage, would say, well, what if we just restrict this 19th Amendment to only white women, and we don't include Black women at all? And so you had some of those kind of conversations taking place, which again did not bode well for there being unity within the suffrage movement between Black women and white women. Still quite a bit of tension there. Now, often what happens, particularly if you're studying suffrage in school, is that the story kind of goes, women suffered and struggled for the right to vote beginning in the 19th century. Finally, in 1920, that happens. Women are able to vote in federal, state, and local elections across the United States. Yes, for suffrage, yay. Well, when you center the perspectives of African-American women, this is not at all where the story ends, not even remotely. Because what you have to take account for is that still at this time, despite the Great Migration, most African-American women are still living in the South. And so just like Black men, they are largely disenfranchised. After radical Reconstruction, again, you would see things like lynching that would often deter people from voting. You would also see things like the poll tax, so basically having to pay a tax in order to be able to vote. And most poor people across the South, not just African Americans, a large number of whites were kept out of voting as a result of the poll tax, but certainly a lot of African Americans. You would see things like the grandfather clause, which said if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. You would see literacy tests saying that if you can't read, you are not able to vote. And then you would also just see intimidation, being told that if you went and registered and attempted to vote, you would lose your job, you would lose your home. And that meant a lot for African Americans who were still sharecropping and tenant farming during this moment. So when we think about the 19th Amendment kind of granting the right to vote to women, there are still disparities because most Black people, men and women, are not able to really exercise that right to vote without some significant penalties that would come their way. At the same time, regardless of this, Black women continue to form voter education groups. They continue to support candidates for office that they did want to back. They continue to protest disenfranchisement and organize in other ways. So even though they couldn't vote, they still embraced movements like Garveyism. They formed different labor groups and unions. They organized in their churches and societies, and they still discussed politics. They still discussed policy. They still discussed how having political enfranchisement and having the vote could become a ticket towards really gaining some of those freedoms and protections that they should have as citizens of the United States. But there's also some tension brewing. The Republican Party would often call on Black women's support during election cycles, but then ignore them otherwise. And there have been similar, calls, if you think about now, with African Americans tending to support the Democratic Party, Same kind of issues that you will see there, and that we'll talk a little bit more later, where people will accuse the Democratic Party of sort of calling on Black women's support during the election cycles, but then afterwards, where are they? And so there you would have these kind of issues creeping up in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s with Black women who were still sort of supporting Republican candidates and supporting political candidates, but not really having support otherwise. And so that became a really difficult issue. You would have Black women such as Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was on the former slide, who would talk about, their role in things like the 1924 election of, Calvin Coolidge, that Black women had formed the National League of Republican Colored Women, saying that we are in politics to stay and we shall be a stay in politics. So while a majority in the South did not have the right to vote, those who were outside of the South still did vote and still did advocate on behalf of political candidates. And Nannie Helen Burroughs was actually able to be a part of a delegation of women visiting the White House and Calvin Coolidge in 1927. And when she addressed the group, she said, "I'm glad to be able to give a touch of color to this meeting. No political party in America is 100% American without this touch of color." So she's clearly kind of giving them a little bit of satire and a bit of sass there, and saying that she's bringing the touch of color. And if that touch of color is not a part of your political process, not a part of your political party, it's not 100% American. So kind of tapping into these ideas about the continued need for Black women suffragists to really argue for political clout and to be considered a part of the democratic process. This goes well beyond the 19th Amendment. It was actually key to the civil rights movement. And again, African American women were essential and central to this. Very often when we talk about the civil rights movement, and this is starting to get better on the part of historians, on the part of people who are kind of breaking open some of these narratives, but it still tends to be very much centered on great men of the civil rights movement. And we don't know as much about the women, about the grassroots folks, about the folks who were in these fights for the long haul. And so I wanted to focus on the efforts of, African-American women suffragists during the civil rights movement, because they were in fact suffragists. They were still fighting for the full, unencumbered right to vote. So the image on the left is of Victoria Gray, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Annie Devine. And these were three women who were a part of what's called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And they are standing in front of the US Capitol in 1965. And essentially what the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, fought for was really for African Americans to be able to take part in Mississippi politics. They were shut out from participating in the Democratic Party. In the 60s is when you start to see the shift of African Americans going from the Republican Party, or the sort of party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party, having jumped over more for Kennedy, more for Lyndon B. Johnson. But essentially what happened in Mississippi is that African Americans were kept out of the state Democratic Party, largely unable to vote, largely unable to run for office. And so these three women and the MFDP argued, well, how are these elections valid? If we are not able to vote, if we do not have representation, how is it that these parties can go forward and represent themselves, as they are the, elected party representing us? How is that possible if we have no say in the political process? So they essentially challenged their state Democratic Party. They took this all the way to Washington, D.C., and there's a very famous moment at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964, where Fannie Lou Hamer, pictured in the middle with a white hat, steals the stage. And in the famous speech that has come to be known as "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," she really talks about some of the very personal things that she went through after attempting to register to vote. She was a sharecropper with her husband. And she talks about how when she registered to vote, she was fired from her job. The home that she was living in was shot at. When she and others attempted to register, they were pulled over by the police and thrown in jail, where she was beaten and also sexually harassed and assaulted. And so it was this very deeply personal, painful testimony about what African Americans were still going through in the South, just trying to exercise the right to vote. And so this moment of really kind of reckoning with the fact that still the suffrage wasn't there for Black men as well as Black women really came to a head. Even more so, with the image on the right is of Amelia Boynton, who was a voting rights activist in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And what you see is her laying on the ground, having suffered some extensive injuries during what was known as Bloody Sunday, when voting rights activists in Selma, Alabama attempted to march and call national attention to the lack of African American voting rights. They were sieged upon by the local police and beaten quite severely. Former Congressman John Lewis, who recently passed away, was also a part of Selma. You saw the film Selma, you would see that there were other figures as well as Martin Luther King, who were a part of this movement. But really it was the efforts of Amelia Boynton and her husband, who had done a lot of work to start folks in Selma along this voting rights path. And they had suffered quite a bit for that. And so this moment here of really thinking about the role of Black women suffragists, we really have to think about the civil rights movement as fitting into this narrative, because African Americans in the 1960s were still really striving and struggling to have their right to vote realized. And so the result of this and the civil rights movement is the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which put into place greater measures for African Americans and all people to have the right to vote unencumbered by things like the poll tax, the grandfather clause, the literacy clause. And there were also some protections in there, and that states that had a history of disenfranchising or blocking the vote of African Americans were supposed to have their election policies and their voting policies sort of vetted by the federal government to ensure that you were not still having some of these problems and issues. Now, unfortunately, over time, that Voting Rights Act has been sort of whittled back and whittled back over and over again, and that there are less protections for people who are seeking the right to vote and who are seeking greater access to suffrage and franchise. So I didn't want to talk about Black women suffragists or the history of African-American suffragists without really talking about the very current moment that we have found ourselves in. And so I pulled some headlines from the 2020 election. These come from Shondaland, the Washington Post, USA Today, and other sort of national news media. So, headline screaming, the 2020 election will be historic for Black women. So kind of forecasting not only the efforts of Black women organizing the vote, but also Black women running for political office, which is something that we really see happening coming out of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There were a few Black women who were in office prior to that point, but certainly after 1965, you're going to see an explosion of that happening, where more and more Black women are running for political office. And then you'll see some headlines here that come after the election. So how Stacey Abrams, LaTosha Brown, and other Black women changed the course of the 2020 election, how Black women worked for Joe Biden's election as president, and finally, Black women saved the Democrats, don't make us do it again. And I think the subtitle for that one is pretty key. We turn out reliably every election, but you can't just vote white supremacy away. So, it's not often that you are able to really see the arc of history and to sort of live in that arc, but I think we are in this moment. And so when you center Black women in this conversation about suffrage, you see not just the history, but what this looks like in real time, right? In the ways in which we are living in, that Black women now, having been cut out from the franchise and having been disenfranchised for a number of years, now playing very pivotal roles, critical roles in elections, and sort of thinking about what does that mean for our democracy? What does that mean for Black communities, for women? There's a lot that can be said here. Um, and the one headline that talked about Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown, I just want to focus on them for a couple of minutes. You may or may not be familiar with these two women. Stacey Abrams had run for the governor of Georgia in 2018 against Brian Kemp, who ultimately won that election, is now the governor. Stacey Abrams ran under the Democratic Party, Brian Kemp under the Republican Party, and she lost by about 50,000 votes. And throughout that 2018 gubernatorial election, there were allegations against Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State at the time, of voter suppression. In fact, there had been close to 1 million voter registrations that have been canceled between 2012 and 2018, with over 500,000 of those happening in 2017 after Kemp announced his run for governor. And many of those voters who were purged from the rolls were not given notice. So they weren't told, hey, we see something going on with your address, or we want to double check you are who you are. None of those notifications went out. So there were a lot of allegations about kind of voter suppression happening that would somehow skew the results of the election. So Abrams lost that election, but in that loss, she announced that she was starting Fair Fight Action. And Fair Fight Action would be an organization fighting for the rights of folks to vote and fighting against voter suppression. And I think we know, or we might have an inkling of what happened with that. I'll get to that in a second. LaTosha Brown, the founder of Black Voters Matter, very similarly played key role in the 2020 election, and also played significant role in the 2017 Alabama elections, in which Doug Jones was elected as one of the first sort of Democrats in a very, very, very long history of Alabama. And she, LaTosha Brown, too, contributed efforts to sort of turning Georgia blue in 2020. And so between Fair Fight Action, Black Voters Matter, and other organizations in Georgia, they registered over 800,000 new voters. And those voters then did something which hadn't been, many people hadn't thought was possible, was turning Georgia blue and essentially being a big push in Joe Biden being elected as the current president of the United States. But again, the story doesn't stop there. And just recently, Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, signed into law a new set of policies that would make it more difficult for people to vote. So taking away some of the times that people were able to vote, taking away people's access, greater access of people to register to vote, you see a lot of those things continuing to happen. And with that, I think you're going to see continued efforts by women like Stacey Abrams, LaTosha Brown, on the part of kind of combating that. Because one of the things that is likely to happen as a result of some of those new restrictions is that it's going to make it harder for people to vote, especially African Americans. So for example, one of the new pieces of that policy is that they are going to limit Sunday voting. And so African American churches, who would often do sort of voting drives on Sundays and getting people to the polls after church, something like that is going to be sort of significantly curtailed should this set of laws continue to stay in place. So just to sort of wrap up and hopefully open it up for some questions, I wanted to sort of summarize some of the key points that I hope you will take away from this presentation. Black women suffragists addressed the ways in which race and sex impacted their lives and political voices. I think, as a society are attempting to come more to terms with, the ways in which gender, race, sexuality, and other intersectional identities play a part in our lives, in the ways in which people are treated and have access and opportunities in society. But for some people, it's still a struggle to understand that the experiences of Black women can be very nuanced, and that experience can be categorically different from the experiences of white women or, Latina women or Asian women, and also that the experiences of Black women can be different from the experiences of Black men. And so what is important to take away from this brief history of African American suffragists is that Black women often address what it meant to be, both Black and a woman, right? That those two things were simultaneous, and that sort of often set a different or alternative course for how they were going to fight, for their rights and their political voices. Also important to understand that Black women suffragists employed a variety of strategies to seek political representation and power. Even when they did not have the formal franchise, they were finding ways to have a political voice and to impact that process. Even once they had gotten the formal vote, but still were largely kept out of those circles, they were finding ways to challenge the power structures that kept them out of it. And even today, they're continuing to sort of find ways to attempt to increase access to the right to vote. And then also, I've said this a number of times when I give this talk and when I talk about, Black women suffragists, is that Black women suffragists will exist as long as racism and sexism form barriers to true democracy and voting rights. So essentially, Black women suffragists are born every day. So there's probably some young women, some little girls who are in this very moment coming into adolescence, who are seeing things that are happening in Georgia, and quite honestly, potentially likely to happen in other states, and they are becoming suffragists. And so when we center Black women's perspectives, Black women's history within this conversation of the suffrage movement, we see that time span is greatly, greatly expanded, right? And that we can start to have conversations about what it means to continue to fight for the vote and to fight for voting rights. So thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I do tend to talk fast, so I hope that you were able to get all of that. And if there are questions, I'd love to be able to answer those.
Okay, thank you so. Let me bring my microphone back down. Thank you so much, Marcia. That was amazing. I am not seeing any questions right now, but if you guys have any, please put them in the chat and I will propose them. I did have one myself, if you don't mind entertaining me with a question. Do you consider Stacey Abrams a suffragist?
I do. I definitely do. Just her efforts to register people to vote and to also to fight against what she saw as suppression and restriction of that vote. I think often we sort of form suffragists as just people who are, they fighting for the vote, they got the vote, it's over. But I think really voting is one of those things that continues to be a struggle. And as there are restrictions put into place, you have to then fight against those restrictions to open it up. So I do consider Stacey Abrams to be a suffragist.
Awesome. Okay, we did have a question in our Q&A that I did not see right off the bat. Anthony Acevedo asks, would you say voter ID laws are rooted in prejudice? And is it politically sustainable for Kemp or others who restrict voting to attempt to decrease access to voting?
Wow, great questions. Thank you so much, Anthony. I would say the way in which voter ID laws in this country have been administered are rooted in prejudice. Is asking someone to provide an ID in and of itself prejudice? I've heard it argued both ways, yes and no. But I think where you have seen those calls for ID laws pop up is in spaces where you largely have people of color who are subject to providing those IDs in ways that others are not. So you see that happen a lot in spaces where you have larger immigrant populations, where people are asked to sort of provide IDs in spaces where others aren't. You will see that happen, for other BIPOC communities as well. And so the administration of those laws and how they pop up at particular times and are enforced more so in communities of color, to me, does root them in prejudice because they are not equally administered, from what I have been able to see currently, and in recent years. Is it politically sustainable for Kemp or others to decrease access to voting? I don't think that it is. I think that it is a reaction to what happened in Georgia and it turning blue and everything that sort of happened, in terms of who was elected coming out of that. But I do not think it is politically sustainable to continue to decrease access to voting. Because what you saw happen in 2018, for example, I don't know if in Georgia you would have had 2020 if you hadn't had 2018, right? And what had happened was sort of purging the votes, the voting rolls, and indiscriminately sort of knocking people off of that. If you hadn't so blatantly done that, I don't know if people would have been fired up to register to vote, and if the same thing would have sort of happened with Abrams' trajectory. So there's a kind of backlash that can happen to that when people know you're taking something away from them. That is often where people say, well, hey, no, what's going on there? As much as it might seem politically advantageous for him and his allies, I do think there's a possibility that there could be a backlash towards that.
Thank you. We have another question from Joseph Oakley. In your opinion, should voter ID be required, not just in certain areas, but on the national level?
I don't necessarily believe that voter ID should not be a barrier to registering to vote. I mean, in most states, when you go to register to vote, you have to put down your address, where you live, and all of that is verified, particularly in that moment as you register. Now, some states will allow you to register sort of on the day of voting, and that will happen, and then they'll have to sort of backtrack and sort of reconcile that. But I do not feel like voter ID laws should be required if they are not going to be required of everyone, regardless of what you look like, regardless of your age, your gender, your race, your background. You are not going to apply it to everyone. In my opinion, it should not be applied at all, because that really is a sticking point, is that if you say you're going to require voter ID, but then it's clear that you are only really using that to challenge BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that is problematic because you are essentially putting barriers in place to the democratic process.
Thank you. All right. That looks like the last question I've seen, unless someone else is willing to pop one in the chat. Do we have any more questions? Okay, we have one more that's coming. Okay.
This one might be a doozy.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, here's one. Was Grimke related to the Grimke sisters?
So can you say more about the Grimke you're referring to? The first kind of Grimke in your question.
Black suffragist Grimke.
Okay, so there are two. So I think you mean Charlotte Fortin Grimke. So there were two Grimke sisters. As far as I know, there is a connection, but I'm not sure if it is by marriage or not. So I don't know if it's a direct sort of lineage to the Grimke's sort of along their maternal paternal lines. It might be that there is a connection via marriage, but I'd have to double check that.
Okay. Still waiting on that other question. Okay, here we are. Oh, we're getting more questions. Awesome. Okay. So this is from Joseph Oakley. In my government class, we had discussed how the benefits of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been lessened over the years, and it was brought up here as well. What are some examples of that?
Sure. So one key example is that when that Voting Rights Act was passed, it was supposed to be that states that had a history of discriminating towards groups and disenfranchising them from the right to vote, that they would have to have their election process essentially vetted by the federal government, that they would have to show how it was that they were allowing people to vote, registering people, how their elections were going to be fair, and that the federal government would have to sort of approve that. But because of, the sort of increase of kind of states' rights, you would have sort of a backlash to the civil rights movement after the 60s. You would start to see some of those things rolled away such that now those requirements don't exist. So for example, if the Voting Rights Act were still in full effect, the state of Georgia would have had to approach the federal government and say, here's how we're thinking about changing our laws when it comes to voting. Is this okay or not? That conversation clearly didn't happen. So that's one of the ways that you would see the Voting Rights Act of 1965 sort of peeled back. And there are also some advocates who argue that if the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were still in place, you would not have had voter ID laws being administered discriminately more to people of color.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Hollenbeck. What else can be done to preserve this valuable history as artifacts from long ago degrade over time?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I think it's, things like this webinar, which will hopefully exist for quite some time for yourselves and for, future students and faculty in South Texas College to see. And I mentioned earlier in my presentation that the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, they have put together a really fabulous digital exhibit that looks at the history of African American women suffragists throughout time. And I think that collection is still growing. So we can certainly kind of, capture the moment and digitize as much as we can to preserve. But also, all of the images that I have pulled from into this presentation, those are all held at libraries and museums across the country. It might be the case that some of your local libraries, museums, perhaps even your university have documents or images, of women suffragists that you could then use to tell those stories. And so, yes, we want to digitize, and sort of preserve things in our current moment. But the other way that we preserve things by continuing to tell the stories. And we can continue to tell the stories by accessing that information, by writing about it, by incorporating it into our papers, incorporating it into our projects, and incorporating it into how we tell the story of suffrage.
Okay, thank you. If you have time, we've got one more question.
Yeah.
All right. What inspired you to make presentations like the one you just presented and teach history of African American suffragists?
Sure. So since I was very, very little, I was always captivated by African American history. In fact, one of the first trips I ever went on with my family, it was an extended trip with my grandmother, my mom, my siblings. We had gone to Washington, D.C. and to Baltimore, sorry, I said it with a T, to Baltimore. And we went to the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum. And that was the first time that I had ever been to a museum. It's the first time that I had ever seen a museum devoted towards people that looked like. And so from that moment on, I became really fascinated with African American history. And so that just kind of became my passion, then it became my professional career. And when I started teaching at the college level American history, I found, specifically this question around suffragists, is that it very much so was, all right, let's start around, 1860s, 1920, that's it. And very rarely did I see African American women's voices there. But because of my own studies, my own interest in that history, I knew that there were voices that could be added. And so I was inspired to kind of give that more time and attention. And so it's kind of morphed into something that I would incorporate into my history lessons on suffrage, and has now become a talk that I give.
Okay, we've got one more, but it's a great ending question. What is your next project? Any chance of focusing on Black women's role in the 2020 elections?
Wow, so that's definitely a great topic, and one I would love to tackle, but I've got a couple of other projects in the works. I'm working on a project about the history of African Americans in Chicago. And then I'm also working on a new civil rights reader with a colleague of mine that really kind of looks at comparison between the civil rights movement and struggles of today, focusing on youth, focusing on women, focusing on issues of class and location. So we may incorporate some things about the 2020 election into that. But I have these couple of other projects that I absolutely have to finish before I can tackle anything else.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we've got, but thank you so much again, Marcia, and thank you everyone who came out to this talk. It was fantastic, and I hope everyone has a fantastic evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.